Morality proves that God exists. Alright, a basic old argument. Premise 1, morality exists only if God exists. Premise 2, morality exists. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Now this is a logically valid argument, and what that means is that if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then the conclusion has to be true. So the only questions are whether or not premise 1 and premise 2 are actually true or not. Now, to be clear, morality doesn't mean people behaving in a moral way, but the very concept that there is such a thing as a moral way in which to behave. And what we're going to take a look at in this video is this argument and then the escapes that people use to escape its conclusion. In other words, this argument leads you to a conclusion and people want to say, well, I don't know if that's really a good reason to jump to that conclusion. What about this? What about this? What about this? So let's go ahead, let's look at some of these escapes. Escape number 1. I don't need God or to believe in God or any of that to know that some things are just plain wrong. For example, I don't need to believe in God to know that what the Nazis did was wrong. I don't need to believe in God to know what Catholic priests have been found to be doing to young boys, that's wrong. Okay, so let's examine this escape. The problem with this escape is that it's merely an affirmation of the second premise of the argument. The second premise of the argument is simply that morality exists, that we know some things are wrong. So this escape from the argument really affirms the second premise. So the question becomes, well, okay, since you believe in the second premise, do you believe in the first premise? In other words, the argument doesn't require you to believe in God to know that things are wrong. What the argument does is it says, since we know that things are wrong, how could we possibly know that if God didn't exist? In other words, what are the ramifications of this knowledge that we know we have? The point of the first premise is that morality requires an idea about the way things ought to be, about the way they should be. And that requires intention and choice and purpose. And you can never base that on something that simply exists or is simply just there. It has to come from somebody. And so morality can't just come from a rock. A rock just is what it is. It can't come from a cake. A cake is what it is. It can't come from anything that just is what it is. It has to come from something that has some sort of intention, some sort of purpose, some sort of choice about the way things ought to be, about the way things should be. And if we admit the reality, it has to come from some sort of ultimate choice, some sort of ultimate chooser, from some sort of divine being. The second escape we want to look at is this idea that morality could be grounded in philosophy instead of God. So sometimes this escape is used, and the reason I want to look at this is because it's important for us to understand philosophy of morality so that we can use that to analyze the other escapes. In other words, this idea that morality can be grounded in philosophy instead of God as some sort of escape from the moral argument for God's existence is absurd and really doesn't understand philosophy of morality at all. What philosophy of morality does is very simple. It simply says we have some sort of moral sense about the way things should be, which is exactly what the argument says. The second premise of the argument is that we have a moral sense. We know certain things are wrong. And philosophy of morality just tries to work out the logical outworkings of our moral sense. In other words, you take a command and you try to guess that, alright, I think this command would work. And then you perform what's called thought experiments. And so in your thought experiment, you think of a situation where all of a sudden it becomes immoral to obey the command, and then you know that your command isn't really a true representation of what we're sensing when we sense morality. And the basic point there is that we don't use moral philosophy to ground morality, but rather it is only ever used to work out the logical outworking of the moral sense that we already have. Escape number 3 is incredibly popular. It's just the idea that morality has evolved and that if you just have a social animal, eventually they will develop a moral sense. So the issue with this escape is that it makes it impossible for us to condemn people like Hitler or the 9/11 hijackers or Jeffrey Dahmer. You know, all of those people, we can't say that they're really wrong, because when we say that morality has simply evolved, what we're saying is that our moral sense is an illusion, and that we only think that what people do is wrong and right, and that we've just evolved to think that because it made us more likely to reproduce in ancient, whatever. And that would mean that our moral sense is an illusion. Our belief that it really is wrong to do something is just something we instinctively think. But there's no actual real wrong ever. And the point here is that if that's the case, then we can't condemn anything. So that's our thought experiment. Well, can we condemn, if morality is evolved, can we condemn Hitler? Can we condemn Genghis Khan? Can we condemn these people as immoral? No, we can't condemn anyone as immoral. All acts become neither moral nor immoral. And so if you really have a real sense where you really, 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 really believe that you know that, for example, there are people who rape, like year-and-a-half-old baby girls. There are those people out there. If you really believe that that's really wrong, and that's not just something that's just evolved, then you believe that morality, has not evolved. The fourth escape is this idea that a lack of morality is self-defeating, and that a species that behaves immorally will die out. Now the problem here is that it doesn't address the question of whether or not we should die out. That's an amoral statement to say that an immoral creature or species or creatures will simply die out. In other words, if you want to say that bad people, if everyone is bad, that we'll all die, that's not a moral statement. That's not a statement about how things should be. That's just a statement about how they are. That we would all die. But the moral question is whether or not we should all die. That is the question. Who cares if it's self-defeating? The question is, should we be self-defeating? What is the purpose? What is the ultimate goal? Why do we exist? Where should we go with our lives? What should we be doing? This question just simply assumes that we all know we should, prosper as a species. But the question is, well, how do you know that? Where does that come from? How do you ground that belief? And to say that it's, it just won't work and it's just not practical to achieve our goals, to, not be moral, well, duh. But the question is, why do we have those goals? Why should we want to prosper as a species? Where does that come from? We all know it, but where does it come from? What is the grounding of that idea? Fifth escape has to be the social contract. The idea that a society has just contracted within itself to behave in a certain way, and so for that society, that just determines what the morality is within that society. Now, the thought experiment is very simple. The Nazis contracted within themselves to exterminate Jehovah's Witnesses, people in nursing homes, Jewish people. If you base morality on social contracts, then you cannot condemn entire societies as wrong in any way. For example, if aliens came from another planet and they saw no point in human rights, and they saw us, as just cattle to be used for whatever they want, and they enslaved us or they ate us or did whatever they wanted, you can't condemn them, right? Because that's their society, right? Sixth escape from the moral argument for God's existence is euthyphro. I gotta admit, I always get that mixed up. But yeah, this comes from a really, really, really old story that Plato wrote us about Socrates, and in a conversation Socrates had with a guy named Euthyphro. And in this conversation, Socrates basically asked, well, do the gods command us to be good because it's good, or is it good because the gods command it? Now, this question gets reapplied in the monotheistic concepts of, monotheistic religions like Christianity, or Islam or Judaism, and it sets up what we call a dilemma. It's the Euthyphro dilemma. In other words, a dilemma is when if you take option A, it doesn't work, and if you take option B, it doesn't work, so the whole thing, I guess, doesn't work. And so the point of this dilemma is to disprove the concept of God as a source of morality. The issue with a dilemma is that we need to make sure we have all the real options on the table. Because if we're missing one, if we forgot about one, if one got left out somehow, then we're not being fair, we're not being logical, we're not being good philosophers. What the Euthyphro dilemma sets up is it says either things are good and moral because God says so, or God commands them because they're good and moral. And the problem is that if it's good and moral because God says so, then God could have made, raping babies moral. And our moral sense tells us, no, that's never going to be okay. I don't care who you are, I don't care what you say, I'm not going to do that. God can't, that just doesn't make sense. Morality isn't, God just on a whim, He just made it in the way that He did. Like He just rolled, the God dice in heaven or something like that. We all understand that doesn't make any sense. But on the other hand, if we say God commands it because it is moral, then, oh no, something's above God. So, if morality is like below God and something He just makes up, we got a problem. But if morality is above God, then we don't really have God. God has to answer to a higher authority. And the real question is whether or not God Himself, or herself, or itself, is good. And can be really described as good instead of just there. And the issue is, this is a false dilemma. Classically, philosophers have responded to the Euthyphro dilemma by saying, yes, this is a false dilemma, and that the correct answer is that morality and God are one. Morality flows from who and what God is. The eighth escape from the moral argument for God's existence is this idea that, okay, well, why don't human beings just make their own morality? Don't we just make our own purpose in life? Can't we just find our own way and do it ourselves? Why do we need God? Can't we set it up? Can't man be the base of morality? Can't man do it? We're here, we're chooser beings, we're alive, we have intention, we have purpose. Certainly we could set it up. The problem there is that, okay, if man is the measure of all things, which man? Hitler, Hugh Hefner, Gandhi? Who? Who gets to be the one? Who gets to be the one who decides how everything is decided when it comes to right and wrong? What person gets that responsibility? And as we've looked at it, how does that person decide? I mean, the Euthyphro dilemma applies to people just like God. And the problem for people is that we can't be equal with morality. That would make us perfect beings. And the thought experiment works, right? We all know that we're not perfect. We all know that we've done things wrong. So obviously morality is above us. The eighth escape that we want to look at is this idea that the God of the Bible is immoral. And this ultimately is irrelevant to the argument. But it usually gets brought up because most of the time when someone makes this argument, they're a Christian trying to convert you to believe in Christianity, and you can simply say, well, the Christian God of the Christian Bible commands evil things to be done. So, a thought experiment can be applied there. Okay, so what are these immoral things? Well, there are situations in the Bible where God commanded the Israelites to slaughter entire, people groups, genocide. God commanded the Israelites to perform genocide. And so, okay, God commanded baby murder. Well, this doesn't make sense with our morality for baby murder to be okay. Now, the problem with this attack on God is that it's way too small. There is a much bigger attack that needs to be made. Because the ultimate question is, will babies die regardless of whether or not Israelites come and kill them? They die for lots of reasons. They get sick, other people come and kill them that God didn't command, and ultimately everybody dies. So the real question is, why does anything evil ever happen? So this greater riddle of why any evil exists is really all that's relevant. Escape number 9 is the problem of evil. This ultimate question of why anything bad ever happens. I mean, let's face it, God's all-powerful. God knows everything. And God's good. But then, why on earth do bad things happen? We would all feel immoral if we didn't stop bad things from happening. If it was in our power, and if we knew about it, and if we could do something, we should stop it, right? Or if not, we're evil. Well, God doesn't stop every bad thing that ever happens. Natural disasters, 9/11, the Holocaust, huge numbers of people murdered under, Joseph Stalin's regime. Where's God at? Where's your God? Where's this God? He doesn't appear to be doing anything. So the issue is, well, gosh, I guess God's not there. I guess the world looks just the way we would expect it to look if at bottom there was no design, no intention, no thought, no planning, no purpose. The real question we have to ask is, could God have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil? Perhaps letting you run your own life. Perhaps letting you and I and all of us be evil or good. And the thing that startles me is, why do atheists place so much importance on the freedom to believe what you want? But then their favorite reason to reject God is that He isn't here taking away that freedom. What do you want? They claim that He should be their omnipotent dictator. They want to sing hymns like, "Oh, most marvelous dictator, we bow in your oppressive tyranny. Glory to God in the highest." The world we live in looks exactly as we would expect it to look if at the bottom there is a design, as long as that design includes human freedom. If every person only ever got what he or she deserved, no person anywhere would really be free. We live in a world where people don't always get punished for doing wrong. Sometimes you get away with it, sometimes you don't. And we don't always get rewarded for doing the right thing. It is only in this kind of world where people do not always get what they, I, you, me, we, us deserve, that we also get the freedom to do what we really believe in, whether good or evil. That's the only way freedom is going to work. If people get their just rewards all the time, they're going to immediately do what they should just so they don't get their just rewards. But the question is, what are people really like? What do people really believe in? And that kind of world where that kind of freedom exists only exists where things aren't always fair. The 10th and final escape. We don't know how to ground morality, but at least we're trying to do something instead of just saying God did it and basing our beliefs on some absurd book from primitive Stone Age people, well, Bronze Age people. At least here we have an admission that there is no ground for morality. But the point of this escape is to say there is some sort of future where we will ground morality. And the logic of the argument is sound. The first premise is clear. Morality cannot be grounded in something. It has to be grounded in someone. And for morality to be enforced for everyone, then that someone has to be the enforcer for everyone. It's as simple as that.